So welcome all, and thank you for coming. Now this evening, we are most privileged to have with us Sanford Greenberg. Sandy has long had the dream that one day blindness can be cured. And he wrote me, in accepting the invitation to speak this evening, the following. He said, "This subject is precisely at one with my personal lifelong campaign, which began to form in my mind the day after I finally lost my eyesight to glaucoma during my junior year at Columbia, some half a century ago. So it is with the greatest pleasure that I accept your invitation to give a talk to the plenary session's attendees on my views on the initiative's organizing topic. I do hope, as your letter suggests, that the group might find value in some pointed reflections on my experience as a blind person." So I'd like now to call on Peter McDonald to tell you of Sandy's remarkable career and what he and his wife Susan, who is also here this evening, are doing to help accomplish this dream of Sandy's. So Peter.
Well, good evening, everyone. John, thanks very much. I'd like to thank you and the organizing committee for arranging for Sandy to speak to us tonight. Like many in this room, Sandy spent many years in graduate school, and he excelled. He got his BA and MBA degrees from Columbia, his master's and PhD from the Department of Government at Harvard. His PhD thesis was on U.S. foreign policy in South Africa. And he was a Marshall Scholar at Oxford and then attended Harvard Law School. He left Harvard Law School to become a White House Fellow under President Lyndon Johnson. He was a part of the successful campaign of Senator John Kennedy for the presidency, was an advisor to Senator Robert Kennedy on Africa, and also worked with Senator Ted Kennedy. In 1966, Look magazine identified him as, quote, one of America's 10 outstanding young men of 1966. At the request of President Clinton from 1994 to 2000, he served as a member of the National Science Board, the governing body for the National Science Foundation, and the scientific advisor to Congress and to our President, Ms. Hopkins. There are many excellent reasons I can imagine why you would have invited Sandy to be a speaker tonight, as he has an enormous and varied life experience and is certainly an eloquent speaker. I understand that a particular catalyst for his selection tonight is that while an undergraduate at Columbia, he lost his vision due to basically what was a physician's error. Sandy's pleased to have the opportunity to speak to the creme de la creme of the vision science community this evening. And I feel honored to be able to give you a brief sense of the special man and good friend that Sandy Greenberg is. So it's my pleasure to ask Sandy to come up and speak to you tonight. Sandy.
Thank you for those exceedingly overly gracious comments about my background. I just have one addition to one of your stories, and that is that in 6th grade, I walked into my classroom, and sitting across the aisle was the most beautiful creature I'd ever met. Now, she did not talk to me in 6th grade or 7th grade or 8th grade or 9th grade. Now, that was the most natural thing at all because I didn't speak to her. And in 10th grade, I mustered up the courage to ask her out on a date, and Lord knows why, but she's still with me, and what can I say other than her courage, her wisdom, and her love have enabled me to be able to stand here tonight. So, From sternum to groin, I was eviscerated. I was pitching, as Peter had suggested, I was a person very much interested in baseball, but in the seventh inning of this game, my eyes got very steamy, and it seemed as though my world was becoming unhinged. And I almost hit the batter, and so I stumbled to the sidelines and dropped to the ground. I went to see an ophthalmologist, and he told me I had allergic conjunctivitis and gave me a topical steroid to be administered regularly. But that was one episode, and I returned to Columbia University as a junior and was as excited about the forthcoming events of that year as I was in my sophomore year. And I had a roommate who loved to sing, and I loved to sing, so we sang together. He played his guitar, and I played my drums, and we recorded this little group, and rock and roll was ours. On weekends, I'd go to his home and play basketball with him. One of my professors was a close advisor to Senator Kennedy at the time, and he had asked me if I would campaign for the young senator. I accepted with glee, and I traveled to many universities around the city of New York, and at first it was quite exhilarating, because at the end of each speech, the audience roared their affirmation. After a while, traveling to the venues became more difficult, more challenging. And when I got back to my dormitory room, I began stumbling around and hitting the desk and the door. And it proceeded to a point where it was embarrassing for me, and my roommates were obviously noticing my awkwardness. And so when the High Holy Day services came about, I went alone, being embarrassed as I was. And it was as if in a movie, the music and the chorus of angels sung as my eyes were being dismantled, and an intense fog covered my eyes once again, first time since my baseball game. I sat in my pew during the entire service, and what I remember most clearly were these words from the rabbi. This coming year, we shall learn who shall live and who shall die, who shall enjoy tranquility and who shall suffer, and who shall be degraded and who shall be exalted. At the end of the service, a janitor came, since I hadn't left, and walked me out onto the street. I bumped into trash cans and street lights. New York City was laughing. A week or two later, my college roommate, who was a bit of a smart-alecky guy, put up a chart in our dorm room that read, Sanford's decline in vision, week by week. We all laughed. It was pretty funny. I had ignored what was happening to me. I was confident that a medical doctor would come in and save me, or certainly my strong constitution would enable me to get over what felt like a nagging cold. You'd just ignore it. Soon, final exams were upon me, and I took my first final in the gymnasium, and I wrote for, I don't know, perhaps an hour, and I looked at my watch and saw absolutely nothing. The proctor took me back to my dorm room. My roommates helped me pack my one suitcase and put me on an 8-hour train ride going from New York up to Albany and then across New York State back to Buffalo. It was a funereal ride. I sat in a seat, my suitcase lodged up against my legs like a shield, as if that would prevent the impending doom. Or not. My eyes were wet. When I got home, my girlfriend picked me up at the train station. When my family saw the circumstance in which I was then existing, my mother insisted we go and see the ophthalmologist who had put me on this regimen of topical steroids, which corrupted, poisoned my eyes. We asked to see a glaucoma expert. My mother and I went up to meet a Dr. Saul Sugar in Detroit on a late afternoon, and he did a thorough exam, and at the end of that, he walked in and, as though he were talking to no one, said, "Well, son, you're going to be blind tomorrow." It seemed strange to me, the use of an old-fashioned colloquialism, son. And even stranger to hear a doctor say straight out to another person, "You're going to be blind," without telling the person how or why. Of course, the son was me. The next day, Valentine's Day, 1961, I entered Sinai Hospital, and the doctor was right. It was my moment of Gethsemane. I had been eviscerated. I had been emasculated. I had become less than human. And the vital part of me had been cut out. So my lungs were made of cardboard, my liver fishing tackle. My kidneys were screws and tacks and sawdust from a carpenter's floor. And all of this was hung together by baling wire from my father's junk shop. My heart burst, showering my mother and me with tears of blood. I promised God, of course I promised myself as well, that for the rest of my life, I would do everything in my power to make sure no one would ever have to become blind in the future. We went back to Buffalo. My girlfriend and my roommate were the two people who supported me the most. I sat in frigid isolation, not wanting to see anyone. But my roommate insisted, and he came up and wanted to take a walk with me. And so we did. The squirrels were emerging from winter. I was too. And he insisted that I come back to college. He told me that when we had studied the Greeks, the classics, that he didn't understand words like tragedy or heroism or greatness, but that now he did. And I'm saying to myself, this man is talking philosophy and I'm dying. Doesn't he understand the obvious? I told him that a social worker in Buffalo had offered me two options in terms of my future career: make screwdrivers or cane chairs in a sheltered workshop. And he said, "Well, you're not going to do that." I said, "Well, my mother suggested that I go to work for my father in his junk shop." He said, "What?" I said, "Well, what's wrong with that?" Oh, nothing. I just didn't think you wanted to do that." He and I had made a pact before we roomed together that if either of us was an extremist, the other would come to his aid regardless of the circumstance of the other. And he said that this pact was important now because he needed me to come back. You are my best friend after all, aren't you? I said, yeah, but this doesn't count. No, this does count. We walked into a patch of sunlight, squeezed in among the great Dutch elms of Buffalo. And I turned to him and I put my hands on his shoulders and I said, I get it. 3 non-committal words, but certainly the stirrings that were already in me to return were strengthened by our conversation. A month later, May 25th, 1961, this President Kennedy, announced that we were going to go to the moon and return a man safely to Earth within the decade. It was certainly bold. It was exciting, and frankly, I don't like to use the I word, but it was inspirational. And I felt that to do something that was seemingly impossible was one thing, but then to set a deadline to meet that impossible goal seemed quite strange to me. Now, let me say that in literature, there's a phrase, in retrospect, inevitable. Today, we assume going to the moon is no big deal. I can assure you, based on what I know, that there was not one thing inevitable about our getting to the moon. It was a statement by him that enabled me to make a decision to return to college, despite the fact that my family and friends told me that I would be killed if I went back to Manhattan. I'd walk off a curb and a bus would strike me. I'd walk into a manhole or a brick would fall on my head because I couldn't see the danger sign. But I set a deadline to my return, and it was that I would return only if I could graduate on time with my class in June of '62. Whatever the price was substantially greater than I had anticipated. I returned to college, and my roommate, true to his word, helped me every day. He walked me to class, walked me back to the dorm room, traveled around the city with me. He read when others failed to come to read to me. He bandaged my legs when I bumped into the concrete benches on campus. But then there was this issue of the tape recorder, this Iron Maiden, this torture rack that I had to lug around campus to tape my classes, then to come back and tape my readers. I rationed myself 4 hours of sleep, and I spent most of that time turning the reel-to-reel tapes around to try and make them move faster. But all I got was distortion. So the year went along that way. I went to see a social worker in New York, and my college roommate went with me. And he waited in the lobby. I spoke to this woman who told me that I had to change my entire view of life. I was now blind, and I had to become blind. I had to learn Braille, and I had to learn to use a cane or a dog. But most important, I had to change my attitude. Well, after a couple of months, I decided that that wasn't for me. And I asked my roommate to take me back to the dorm. Well, he said, I can't really even though he had been for the previous month. I have a sketch due tomorrow morning of the Seagram building. He was an architecture student and a good one. I said, but don't you understand? I have a reader coming to see me at 4 o'clock. And if I don't meet that reader, I won't be able to graduate with our class. And frankly, it would be ruinous to my career. He said, no, I'll tell you what, just come with me for a little while and I'll take you back then. Well, we debated rather heatedly for about 20 minutes, and he walked away and I walked away. It was rush hour, and so I inserted myself into the middle of the rush hour crowd, and they got me to Grand Central Station. I clung to the railing tightly and walked down the steps until I got into the cavernous hall. And before I knew it, walking with outstretched arms as though I were a sleepwalker, I ran into this large iron column which cut my forehead open. And I felt as though I had been hit by a large electric frying pan because there was a metallic ring throughout my entire body. But I couldn't stop, and the next thing I knew, I bumped into something soft, a woman's breast. And she said, pardon me. And I said, oh God, please forgive me. She said, well, that's a first even in my line of work. And I said, will you please forgive me? And then she put her hand on my forehead to wipe away the blood. And she said, you're a nice boy. I didn't know whether I was a nice boy or whether I was a boy at all. And then she walked away and said, you know, it's always hardest at first, but it gets easier over time, I think. I was relieved. This encounter could have been much more catastrophic. As I walked away rapidly, I fell over a stroller with a baby in it, and the mother was screaming at me as I crawled away and apologized, and suddenly I found my upper body hanging over the end of the platform, smelling the dirty, greasy, oily tracks of the train. The train was going to come by soon, and I was hoping it would come by and sever me, to end this fakery that I had to go through to try and pretend to my girlfriend, my roommate, my family, that I was just a regular guy, because I wasn't a regular guy. I wanted to be both dead and alive, but only alive if I could get out of that pit and see again. I thought, too, that maybe I had died without knowing it, and that this was what death was like. Death was Grand Central Station at rush hour, and you are blind. I stumbled to the shuttle, got to the train that took me uptown to Broadway and 116th, and as I walked toward the iron gates of Columbia, I bumped into a man who said, oops, I'm sorry, sir, with a sardonic sir. Of course, it was my roommate who had followed me the entire way. He didn't have a sketch to turn in. I was enraged and I was going to hit him, but instead I hugged him. It was a moment of redemption because I had entered the subway with one particular Weltanschauung, and when I came out, I had a different worldview. I had no more doubt and fear, and more than anything, I felt that there were no limits to what I could accomplish. That story, that episode defines me. Defined me then, it defines me tonight. I did graduate with my class, but there was the matter of the tape recorder. I was going to graduate school, several graduate schools, actually, as Dr. McDonald pointed out, and there was no way I could continue, and so I felt that I had to figure out what was happening. And it seemed to me that throughout history we've always been communicating by speaking and listening. And 500 years ago, Gutenberg came along with the printing press. Now, it was a boon to humanity, but it was a disaster for the blind because they were sent into the backwater of history. As Dr. McDonald reported, I'm speaking to you now at about 150 words a minute. Tape recorder will play back 150 words per minute. Louis Braille developed a system which was quite excellent, but the fastest Brailleist in the world is, I know it, can read at 90 words a minute. It was reported that President Kennedy took a speed reading course and he could read at 1,000 words a minute. So those were the parameters. And I decided then to invent a machine that would enable people to listen as rapidly as they could read, to compress speech. I set a deadline within the decade. The question to me was, how do you change the mechanical energy of the voice box into electrical energy? Now, I had taken physics from Professor Letterman at Columbia, and so I knew a little bit about it. When I got to Harvard, there were some physicists who read to me, and we talked, and there were some friends at MIT that they introduced me to, and these conversations were very important as background, but they were not determinative. What was an introduction to the head of the speech and acoustics laboratory at Bell Labs. On May 25th, 1969, I had the fundamental patents in the field of electronic compression and expansion of human speech. Now, millions of blind people have been helped by this, and sighted people as well. But in a way, it doesn't really matter, because the blind can have Braille and tape recorders that compress speech and computers that have software that enable them to read faster. But with the cane and the seeing eye dog, it doesn't really matter. They are not going to find employment for the most part. And of course, it's very difficult to become educated if you can't achieve parity with your sighted companions. Well, there was this White House, and I think today, as I did then, that it was a great honor to work in the White House. It was like a soldier, a sailor, a Marine standing guard at the tomb of the unknown soldier. America doesn't have a lot of these honors. But of course, that's my perspective in the 1960s. I was a Kennedy man walking into a Johnson house. This was a colossal house, and those of us who were working there were working for a colossus, that being President Lyndon Baines Johnson. I could recite seriatim, the projects, the ideas that provided the intellectual platforms for companies that I would build in the future, the task forces, the issues. But none of that would be as important to me as a meeting I had with one person named Saul Linowitz. He came to Washington about the same time I did. He was ambassador to the Organization of American States. He had been chairman of Xerox. And we became intimate friends, and over time we would have biweekly luncheons for about 4 hours a time. He told me of a story that Joe Wilson, the CEO of Xerox, when the company was flagging, called him and said, "Saul, what do I do?" And Saul said to him, "Think IBM. Think big." I hadn't shared my promise, the promise I'd made in Detroit Sinai Hospital, with anyone until Saul told me that story. And I did share it with him. Sometime later, he called me and he said, "I'd like you to meet Dr. Jonas Salk." Dr. Jonas Salk. The three of us met in Ambassador Linowitz's office for the better part of an afternoon. When I walked out of the building, I asked the gentleman who was driving me to take me to an open space so I could be alone. And I sat on a ledge with grass and trees behind me, and at first, all I could do was eavesdrop with the birds. And then I became extremely excited by what had just happened, because I had been underwater, held underwater until now. I could resurface, and perhaps there was some hope for the promise I had made to God. For Salk had said, "Forget treatment, end polio. End it, end it, end it." On October 18th, 2012, with the incredible support of my wife, my family, and Dr. McDonald, I announced that we were establishing a prize to be given to the person or persons who would do most to end blindness. And of course, there was a deadline by 2020. The prize was conceived to shift the mentality in the research community from traditional focused specialization toward a more holistic cooperation. That means cooperation and investigation across the entire spectrum of vision. The literature is already reporting a growing body of this cross-fertilization. That's why we 2020 zealots talk about ending blindness, not the more cautious, the more sensible, ending this or that eye disease. Our governing council consists of Dr. McDonald, Dr. William Brody, the president of the Salk Institute, Mr. Jerry Spire, the CEO of Tishman Spire Properties, owner of Rockefeller Center and other iconic landmarks throughout the world, Dr. Morton Goldberg, the chairman of the board of Foundation Fighting Blindness Clinical Research Institute, Mr. John McCarter, the chairman of the Board of Regents of the Smithsonian, and Mr. Michael Mukasey, the former Attorney General of the United States. We recently decided that we were going to create a scientific jury to help go through the applications for the prize. And the most fortunate event recently has been that Dr. Dowling, Dr. Alfred Sommer, the Dean Emeritus of the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins, and of course the chairman of the Albert and Mary Lasker Foundation, and Dr. Joshua Sains, the Center for Brain Research at Harvard, have agreed to serve on the search committee for the scientific jury. And I would like to ask each one of you in this room that if you have any nominees for the scientific jury, please contact Dr. McDonald, Dr. Dowling, Dr. Sommer, Dr. Sains. By now, you know that I am a licensed dreamer. And I've had the pleasure of participating in a forum for dreamers, or at least that's the way I look at it, the World Economic Forum, for the past decade. In the last couple of years, I had proposed to the leadership that if they were looking for big dreams, then end blindness by 2020 ought to be put on their formal agenda. 2 months ago, Dr. Sommer and Dr. Sains were a panel of two in Davos, Switzerland, talking about end blindness by 2020, which will also be included on the 2015 agenda. Finally, I ought to respond to Dr. Dowling's basic question to me. What aspect of vision is most important to me that medical science restore? Well, here's what I think. In nature, all eye diseases are obviously aspects of a unitary system of vision. You are all uncovering the secrets of that system. You're collectively piecing together a model that tracks it. This model will resemble the standard models in physics, and a full understanding of the linked operations of parts within the visual system will generate hundreds of dispositive treatments. But our standard model is incomplete. And so I'm asking all of you with your community of searchers around the world to please complete it. Like Dr. Salk and President Kennedy, I discount those who say, oh, so sensibly, you cannot do that. In the spirit of the Judgement of Solomon, I cannot accept that the study of eye disease be torn apart. Young, blind children will, over time, ask or know that for more than 6 million years, humans and their bipedal ancestors have been afflicted by blindness. They will ask, as did Martin Luther King in 1963, how much longer do we have to wait? An omission that I really shouldn't have made, but when my girlfriend, my wife, and I were at Oxford, I received a phone call from my college roommate, and he asked if I could send him $400. We had $404 in our account. Now, each of us, I think, likes to live cleanly. We don't want to be indebted. And I found his request to be a gift for me. But of course, I will always be indebted to him. He took the $400 and he entered into a musical partnership with Paul Simon. They called the group Simon and Garfunkel.